Great Minds series hosted by the Department of Social Sciences. My name is Yuri Mansouri, and I'm Associate Professor for the Department of Social Sciences. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the support of the department itself. Professor Jeff Terry, who is here, I think, has been a great supporter of this seminar series, and also Professor Hao Huang, who is the faculty in charge of the organization of the seminar. Our speaker today is Professor Sandy Dall'Erba, who is a professor of agricultural and consumer economics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I think you also have a joint appointment at the Department of Urban Planning,
That is
right?
true. Mhm.
Yes. Um, and he's currently the director of REAL, REAL, which stands for Regional Economic Analysis Laboratory, also at UIUC. His research focuses on the regional dimension of general economic growth, regional development policies, innovation, and the economic impact of climate change, which I think is going to be part of, if not the focus of today's presentation.
That is correct.
And for his analysis, he used tools of regional science, including spatial statistics, spatial econometrics, and interregional input-output model. Professor Dall'Erba is an author of more than 60 peer-reviewed journal articles. 2021 is still in progress, but when I last checked, he already published 7 papers, right? So, actually, I want to know what is the secret sauce for such a high
Let
rate
me
of
think.
productivity.
Let me think.
um, he's been the recipient of various awards and grants, the National Science Foundation, NASA, and United States Department of Agriculture, as well as from the previous associations, including the Regional Science Association International and Regional Science Policy and Practice Journal. So with that, I'm going to turn over the floor to Professor Dall'Erba, who's going to talk about one of his most recent papers on how the U.S. interstate trade could actually mitigate the negative impact of climate change and crop profit.
Great. Yuri,
Thank you.
Hao, thank you so much for having me. Yuri, thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. I've never had such a kind introduction, so I really appreciate it. So Yuri is right. Among the different questions and techniques that I'm highly interested in, there is the one of climate change. It's actually increasingly part of the focus of my work. So I'm going to show you one of the most recent contributions along those lines, and hopefully I will convince you that it's an interesting topic to focus on. Um, so it's working command with a former and a current PhD student of mine. John Young is now doing a postdoc, and Noé shall defend his PhD, I think, next year. Um, I'm also, in addition to real that you spoke about, I started to develop this summer a new center which is focusing on climate issues and using different techniques of either trade economics or regional economics to look at a system approach. And the presentation of today is an example of how you can combine those topics with those techniques. On my side, the presentation is 100% solar powered. I was lucky to install a few panels on the roof of my house a few years ago. And I was also lucky to get some support from USDA, the Department of Agriculture, for this work. And here are the motivations. So the first element I'd like to really convey to you is, well, given this audience, I really think that nobody doubts that climate change is real. You're a much easier crowd to argue about that than other crowds I have to meet in the past. But the one element which is important to remember is that in addition to that traditional increase of temperature that's expected, we shall always remember that it's going to come in addition to an increase in frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. And you will see that for the analysis I will present today, droughts, which is one type of extreme weather event, is going to be my main focus. It obviously has a very large impact on agriculture. It, by default, is going to lead to a decrease in yield. And the one element I'm going to show you today is that it will also affect trade of agricultural products in the US. And the issue that we are facing, I think, of this century is a combination of weather pattern, which is becoming more and more unpredictable, on the top of a population which is growing. So the US population will grow between now and the end of the century, but at the world level, the increase is really tremendous. We are currently looking at 9 billion people on Earth. By the end of the century, we're going to be 11 billion people. So the question really becomes, how do you end up producing enough food for everybody? So it leads to a question of food security, which, in spite of the level of wealth of the US, are still questions that we need to be concerned about, because the US is a big player in the international market of food. And even within the country itself, there are some discrepancies with respect to food security. So looking at that link of climate change, impact on agriculture, and eventually impact on other elements of society is definitely not new. There are some prestigious economists who have already looked at those questions, like Bob Mendelsohn, Olivier Duchesne, and so on and so forth. But the one criticism that I have about the work that they have done, and that has appeared in really very good economic journals, is that they do not care whatsoever about questions of interregional spillover. So in other words, when they are trying to understand what is the sensitivity delta yi of an outcome, let's say the yield of a crop, or profit in agriculture, or eventually the value of farmland, with respect to delta ci, which would be some kind of weather characteristics or climate characteristic, they can obviously find some beta coefficient, which is capturing that elasticity. But all of that is very much embedded on the specific location that they use in their analysis, whether it is a state or a county. In other words, as you can see on the right-hand side, there is absolutely no effect of some weather or climate event in location J on an outcome, farmland, or a productivity in agriculture in location I. In other words, there is absolutely no link in space. Okay? In my view, this is simply not the way the world works. This is simply not matching reality. So myself and some in the field have been looking at ways to actually include forms of interregional spillovers into that wonderful question. And the way it has been treated so far is mostly based on degrees of connections which are dealt with geographical proximity. So there is a lot of spatial econometric works along those lines, basically showing on how changes in weather in places nearby might affect not only their outcome, but also your own outcome. I have myself done a bit of work along those lines. But it seems to me that there are other network structures that we need to think about when we want to really understand how places relate with each other. I just completed another work with a former student of mine, Jimon Bae, and we discovered that surface water flow is another mechanism by which you do see that relationship in space. Today, on the other hand, I'm going to be focusing on the other network, and potentially the most important network when it comes to that relationship between climate and outcome in agriculture, which is trade. So what I'm going to show you today is a contribution which is still based on econometrics, but we're going to also rely on a network trade, which is completely endogenous and is going to be evolving in time as a function of the impact of the variables of interest that I have, which are drought events. Okay? That particular work is the very first contribution looking at the role of weather on trade at the domestic level. I have not found any other contribution along those lines. Yes.
I'm sorry, Sandy.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Sandy. It sounds like you are echoing. Do you have another mic right now that is currently on?
Let me. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. Let me just set myself differently. I don't know if it comes from the app or from my computer. So let me see. Let's use the one which is built in. What about now? Is it better?
Much better. Thank you so much.
Okay. That's fine. Now, thanks a lot, Yuri. I did not know, obviously. Okay. So as I said, first contribution looking at that relationship between climate and and yield and trade in agriculture at the domestic level. There is quite a lot of work that is already ongoing at the international level. The work of maybe Arno Costino at MIT, Schenker, for instance, or even John Riley, also from MIT. But it's only international level. And for countries as big as the US, I think that looking at what's happening within the country matters very much. So this is what I'm going to offer today. So let me start with a short question for the audience here, because I don't have a good sense of how much you know with respect to trade in agriculture in the US. So let me start with that first question on the top. How many of you believe that the percentage of the US agricultural production which is exported to the rest of the world is 11% versus 21% versus 41%? So how do I get feedback from you? I don't really know. Is there some kind of a chat here on? Yeah, okay, good. I see there's a chat. Okay, so Len says it's B. So let me recap. What percentage of the US ag production is exported to the rest of the world? One of the answers is correct. How many of you believe it's 11 versus 21 versus 41? So just give me your insight, and then we're going to discover later on what you found. Okay, so Yuri says A. Okay, Piotr says A or B. Interesting. Okay, what else? That's it? Hao says C. Very good. Who else? Who else wants to participate here? Okay, so let's correct that. Let's look at the questions the other way around, and I'm going to give you the answer next. Let's look at the questions the other way around. If you look at the stock of agricultural products in the US, combining basically what is used for final demand, like so the avocados that you get from Mexico, or what is being used for the intermediate demand, such as food manufacturing or livestock, right? Sometimes there is some grains which are imported, say, from Canada in order to feed beef in the US, for instance. So what percentage is that? How much of that is foreign? Is it 8%, 28%, or 48%? What do you think? Oh, there is more hesitation here. In other words, how much of all the ag products available in the US is actually foreign? 8%, 28%, and 48%. Just pick one, and then we'll discover later what it is. So Hao says, okay, D or E, very good. Some offer F. All right. Okay, very good. All right, so we're going to look at the answer together in just a few minutes. I want to keep the suspense high so far. All right. What is it that I'm going to do in this work? What I'm going to do is obviously uncover that question of climate change and yield effect and impact on trade, as well as impact on profit in agriculture through a two-stage process. In stage number one, I'm going to calibrate a gravity model of trade. There is a very extensive literature on that particular technique. And as you remember, my focus is related to droughts. So the results I'm going to get from that first stage regression is to show you that export, when I mean export or import, is really from one state in the US to another state of the US, right? There is nothing related to foreign nation in this analysis. So exports from one particular state are going to be negatively affected by the drought in the origin state. And I hope you agree with me that it makes sense in the sense that if you have a drought, your own yield decreases, therefore you have much less to export, right? I'm going to also show you that export is actually positively affected by a drought in a destination state. The destination state is experiencing a drought, suddenly their own yield has decreased. Therefore, if they want to feed their livestock or if they want to carry on with their food manufacturing activities, they're going to have to import agricultural goods from elsewhere. In a second stage, I'm going to use that expected value of trade flows from stage one and plug it into what is called a Ricardian model. A Ricardian model is a model by which we try to estimate the extent to which profit in agriculture are a function of local characteristics, such as the local weather, the local demand, and things of that nature. But on the top of that, I'm going to add that estimated value of stage one, which is going to reflect the extent to which crop profit in location I are a function of export to other states in the US, which themselves are a function of drought event in other states of the US. Now you get a sense of how those spillover effects, which are embedded into trade flows, are going to take place. Okay, what are we going to find from stage 2? We're going to find that local profits of a state, increase when the trade partners are going to experience a drought. Okay, so overall, combining those two elements, I'm going to show you how we can calibrate the extent to which trade is a wonderful tool to mitigate the impact of climate change and of drought events. Let's discuss first a bit the database, and we're going to have the answer to the questions I asked you earlier. So the database that I'm using is from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. It's called FAF, Freight Analysis Framework. It's a wonderful database. We're very lucky to have it because that version number 4 of FAF is the first one that is going to distinguish flows which are for a domestic purpose versus flows which are for external purpose. So for instance, when Illinois is moving corn from the state of Illinois up to Louisiana, we have a good sense of how much of that will be used in Louisiana in order to feed the cattle or be processed for food manufacturing in Louisiana, versus the corn that comes from Illinois that is shipped to Louisiana in order to be exported through the New Orleans harbor to pretty much the rest of the world. So we really know what stays in the country versus what is exported, and obviously my focus is on what stays within the country. So it's a panel data set, which is going to focus on the 4 years that you can see here, and the focus is on crops, fruits, and vegetables, okay? I do not do livestock, I do not do food processing at this stage, for the reason that my main variable of interest, which is drought, has a very strong effect on any activity which are taking place outdoors. Chicken or beef can be raised indoor, and food processing is obviously indoor. So they tend to be much less sensitive to drought events. Therefore, I focus only on that category of products. And to answer the question I had for you, it turned out that the US is a very self-sufficient country. In spite of what we hear in the news, more especially during the 90s or the early 2000s, also trade wars between the US and the European farmers, when you actually look at the values, the US does not export too much of its production to the rest of the world. It's only 11%. And inversely, the US does not import very much of its food that is consumed from the rest of the world. It's only 8%. So it's a very self-sufficient country. And it's one more reason why I'm so excited about working on the US as a unit of analysis, as opposed to the entire world. There is definitely a lot to be learned about the food system within the country. As you can imagine, some states are very big players and some are much less big in terms of that production of agriculture. If you look at the basic data coming from FAF, at the bare minimum, one particular state exports 25% of its production, and the most export-oriented state, which I think is our state here in Illinois, exports up to 88% of its production. Inversely, in terms of import, one state imports just 10% of what is going to be consumed in that particular state. And another state, I believe it's Rhode Island or some of the tiny states on the northeastern part of the US, import up to 95% of what is being consumed for agricultural products. So who are the big players? Well, here you have those 2 years, 2007 and 2012. On the x-axis, you have the export in $1 million, and on the y-axis, you have the import in $1 million. And you do see that we are the big one. Illinois, which is closely followed by Minnesota, California, and Nebraska. And then other states, well, depending on the kind of agriculture they grow, whether it is mostly for food processing, whether it is mostly for the feeding of livestock, or whether it's a state with a large or small population, you see pretty much where they fare in a food system in a country. Another way to look at those relationships is through the two graphs we are looking at here. It's called chord diagram. Give you a sense of origin and destination of the flows. It's a little bit difficult to analyze each of them based on this, so I'm going to focus on one state in particular, which is Nebraska. And more especially, we're going to be focusing on the relationship between a drought event and how it might actually disrupt the entire trade system within a country. On the left-hand side, you have the year 2007. And on the right-hand side, you have the year 2012. So the big difference between those 2 years is that in 2007, there was no drought in Nebraska. You can see that on that map on the top left here. So in 2007, you have a sense of all the places that Nebraska was exporting to, mostly California, Colorado, and you get a sense of all the places Nebraska was importing from. You see South Dakota is a big deal, Kansas, Iowa, for instance, okay? Now in 2012, Nebraska, and like many other states in the US, experienced a very big drought event. And now you have a sense of how that event perturbated not only the yield and the export of Nebraska, as we would expect, but it also led to a major shift in the trade flows from different origin states. So you see here that ratio of export of Nebraska compared to the import has really shifted compared to the 2007 year when there was no drought. In 2012, Nebraska had to import a lot more from Iowa, a lot more from Colorado, for instance, and a lot more from Kansas, okay? Why? Well, because Nebraska, in spite of that drought, still had to feed its cattle, still had to carry on with food processing activities in order to feed either its own population or eventually, once the good has been transformed, to export that particular good to the rest of the US or eventually the rest of the world. But also the activities had to carry on. So because their own yield of crops, fruit, vegetables went down, they had to obviously get it from elsewhere. So now you get a sense of the extent to which a drought event in location I will obviously have an effect on location I. But on the top of that, it will also affect what happens in location J's, because those location J's are going to step in order to compensate for the decrease in yield in location I. Okay, that's really the entire point of my presentation today. So let's focus a little bit about the drought per se. There are different ways of capturing that drought events. In different indices exist out there. We decided to go with the most popular of them. It's called PDSI, which is a Palmer Drought Severity Index. And that severity is going to be measured by any drought event which has a value below -3, which, as you can see here in that red circle, really corresponds to a severe drought. We tried with somewhat less severe degree of intensity of that drought, but all the results are very robust. So we decided to go with -3. Here, I want to give you a sense that depending on the years, that drought event covered different parts of the country, and 2012 was definitely the worst of the years of my sample. In that particular day of July 31st, 2012, slightly more than 70% of the US territory was declared under extreme drought. So it was really a big deal in the country, and more especially in the Midwest, okay? So drought data come from NAR. They are monthly measurements for every single county. And I'm going to use the transformation you're looking at here in order to convert all of that into drought measurements for every single day and across the entire state, because my unit of analysis is not county, it is state. The reason being that the trade flows I rely on are at the state level. How do I do that? I'm going to simply do a weight, which is proportional to the share of cropland in a particular county over the entire cropland area of a particular state. In other words, if in a particular year there was a drought event on your location of Chicago, I will not care much about it. If, on the other hand, that drought event was in my Champaign County, where we do grow corn and soybean, then it will matter very much. So one element that is important to think about too about that drought is the relationship with respect to timing. And I have spoken with roughly a dozen of colleagues of mine who do extension work, who are much more familiar than me on that relationship between weather and really the yield of a crop. The question I had for them is there a particular moment of when a drought event takes place that will be particularly damaging on the yield of a particular crop? It turned out that they don't really know. In other words, it's still very unclear whether the drought event is taking place during the harvest season or during the growing season or pretty much at any time during the year. So without real clarity with respect to when that drought event is really damaging to the crop, I'm going to show you results which are going to encompass all those different options when drought events are measured for the entire year versus the growing season, which is roughly April to September, versus 3 months before harvest, okay? Because again, it's very unclear as to what timing really matters. Stage number 1 is based on a gravity model of trade. There is an extensive literature related to that. Let me directly go to the reduced form model, where in a panel setting over 4 years, I'm going to try to estimate the factors that explain the export of a state I to a state J at a particular time T. That export is going to cover only crops, fruits, and vegetables, okay? Exports are going to be a function of what are called dyadic terms, terms which are linking origin and destination. The first one of them is a home state effect, because as you can imagine, some states are producing and going to transform that particular raw product for food manufacturing within the state. An example of that is in town here in Champaign-Urbana, we have a craft company which is going to transform some of the raw product into either cheese or whatever they sell. So you have to control for the home state effect. But we also control for other quite well-known dyadic effects, such as the border effect, if two states are contiguous from each other, and the travel time between a state I and state J. Okay, so do not evolve in time. Therefore, they can be accounted for by fixed effect. At the same time, you have to account for a set of pull and push factors. On the push side, which are related to the state of origin, we're going to account for agricultural GDP of that state. It doesn't make much sense to account for the overall GDP because it is not much related to agricultural GDP. So we focus only on the type of goods we're interested in. And we're going to control also for what is called a multilateral resistance term. MLRT are basically capturing the extent to which when a state is producing something, it can have a set of customers. That state can obviously sell to itself or can sell to a particular state J, but any sale that is done to J means those are sales which are taking place at the expense of sales to K, L, M, whatever other state. So you have to account for that particular element. Inversely, on the pull side, which are elements related to the places of destination, we're going to account for food manufacturing GDP in location J. Why? Because this is the main pull factor of those flows, right? Most of the crops, fruits, and vegetables are not directly for human consumption. They are going to be transformed first. So we account for the food manufacturing GDP in J, as well as the multilateral resistance term from J2, which are capturing the fact that any J state, destination state, could be purchasing from many different I or origin states. And then you have a set of covariates, which are capturing the variables I'm interested in. Degree days, which is some measurement of temperature, if you want. Drought days, which are definitely the variable of interest, both at origin and destination. And rainfall, both at origin and destination. And I also have a set of fixed effect by climate zones, because we do have different climate zones in the country, in order to account for also unobserved characteristics, which might be specific from differences which are taking place in different parts of the country. For instance, the reason why Illinois is selling corn to Florida and importing oranges from Florida is because we really are in different climate zones and therefore grow very different products. You have a sense here of the 9 climate zones which are going to be accounted through those dyadic fixed effect. Okay, let's go directly into the estimation of that trade model here, and let's focus on columns 3 and 4. Where the estimates are based on Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood, which is a chosen estimation process for trade models. You have in red here the variables of interest. So let's focus directly on that. So what do we discover? Well, we discover that when a drought event is taking place in a state of origin, is going to decrease the yield and is going to decrease the export of that particular state. Now, it is true that the sign is negative, going into the expected direction, but it's not significant. So why is that the case? Well, the reason is because most of the states, mostly the states which are producing grains, have the capacity of storing some of the grains from the previous year and eventually up to 2 years ago. So even if a drought is taking place at year T and indeed decreases their export, it does not decrease it from a statistical point of view because they can rely on the reserves they have done before. Okay. Inversely, for cases where a drought event is taking place in a state of destination, those particular states have a decrease in their yield, yet they still have to carry on with food manufacturing activities and they still have to feed their livestock. So how do they achieve that? They achieve it by importing from elsewhere. This is the reason why you see that positive and significant result when a drought day is taking place in destination state. You are going to export much more to those particular places. We tried so many robustness checks in order to verify whether that particular relationship of drought in origin and drought in destination was robust or not. For instance, we looked at different special units. We looked at whether those trade flows had elasticities that would be modified if we focus on just grains versus fruits and vegetables. We looked at whether the result would be different, were we to look at trade flows in terms of volume as opposed to that combination of volume and price. We looked at the relationship based on different moments when drought is taking place, as I told you earlier, whether it is just before harvest or during the growing season. We even looked at adding some pull and push factors such as population or crop stock, ethanol use or biodiesel use. In all cases, as you can see here, the results are very consistent. You will always find a decrease, and which is not significant, in the event of a drought day in the origin state, and you will see an increase of trade following a drought event in a destination place, and that particular result is significant. So what are some of the elements that draw those results? Without going too deep into the detail, if it's mostly based on reducing the number of trade partners when you have yourself a drought that you experience, and that's more especially valid in the event of a drought that affect grains. And it will also decrease how much you are going to export. So you see that a decrease in export, more especially for grains, is leading to a combination of reducing the number of places you're exporting to and reducing the value of the flow because your yield has decreased. So that was step one. In step number two, I'm going to focus on really the question I'm trying to solve, which is, what is the extent to which climate is affecting the profit in agriculture? Okay, but of course, I'm going to account for what the stage one was telling us. There are two ways traditionally to account for the impact of climate change on agriculture. One is called a crop production function. That particular approach, in some cases, has been qualified as an approach whereby farmers are dumb. I don't really like to describe it as such, but the underlying idea basically says that even if the climate has changed, the farmers do not adapt whatsoever. It will be a case whereby a farmer 50 years ago used to grow corn, is still doing corn now, and will still do corn by the end of the century. It still has some value to focus on one particular crop because you really do see how a specific crop, a specific activity is sensitive to changes in climate. But it's true, there is no adaptation whatsoever. And in the US, there is already enough evidence to indicate that farmers do adapt one way or another, okay? The second approach is called the Ricardian approach. That one is basically an aggregate function of all the agricultural activities. So the measurement is going to be entirely based on profit in agriculture or eventually the value of farmland. And by doing that, it doesn't matter anymore if the farmer is doing corn or soybean or wheat or livestock or even ecotourism. It doesn't matter whatsoever. It's really an aggregate approach. And in that case, adaptation is accounted for because implicitly you model the extent to which the farmers move along different activities. An example of it is that a graph you see at the bottom, where you see on the x-axis, temperatures are increasing with climate change. And on the y-axis, you see the profit per acre of a particular activity. Well, activity one, for instance, will be optimal with a fairly low level of temperature. But if you really stick to that activity, like in a crop production function, at some point, the temperature has increased so much that that particular activity is not really optimal anymore. Instead, you should be switching to another activity which happens to be able to manage a higher temperature. An example of it is that, for instance, wheat is much more resistant to high temperatures than corn. So eventually you will be switching from corn to wheat, right? And so on and so forth. That's the Ricardian approach, which I'm going to use here. So as I said earlier, how do you calibrate that particular approach? Well, the dependent variable is profit in agriculture, no matter what kind of activity you do in ag. And it's a function of a set of variables which are locally measured, such as the weather or some socioeconomic variables, like I'm going to show you here. So my stage 2 specification is the one you have here, where agricultural profits in state I for crops, fruits, and vegetables, and before subsidy, I really don't want to go into subsidy because they are clearly endogenous, calibrated for every single state and for 4-time period, are going to be a function of drought event in location I, as well as weather event in location I. So I bring back all my precipitation and degree days as before, as a function of XIT element, which are those local demand, such as density of population, income of the local population. But more especially, it is also a function of that estimated value of export, EXIT, which is itself coming from the estimated value of those trade flows of stage number 1. And they will matter. The story I'm trying to convey here is that drought event in destination places, as well as in origin places, are going to affect how much you are exporting. And as a result, it will affect your own agricultural profit. Okay. Coming from a state like Illinois, where we know that we are definitely not going to eat all the corn and the soybeans that we grow, I think that by nature, we have a good sense that the profit in agriculture of farmers in our state are very sensitive to the extent to which they're able to export to either other states in the US or even to the rest of the world. And on the top of all those variables, we will have a set of state fixed effect and climate zone and year fixed effect to control for all those unobserved characteristics. So what do we get out of it? Well, let's focus directly on estimates, which are including trade, column 3 and 4. We see that obviously total exports are positively affecting agricultural profit of a particular state, okay? Like we would expect, as well as other covariates, local covariates. You see, for instance, that precipitation has a positive and significant effect, but it's a relationship which is concave. You see also density has a positive effect on agricultural profit, which is a measurement of local demand, okay? Where are we at? Well, basically, I'm trying to convey the fact that we have to include state into that analysis. The point I'm making here is, if you do not include trade, the measurement of the marginal effect of a local drought on your local agricultural profit is going to be some coefficient theta. Fine, you have it. And the theta is expected to be negative, of course. You just decreased your yield, right, with a new drought. At the same time, without trade, it also means that a drought event in location J has absolutely no impact on your own agricultural profit. But the point I'm making is that with trade, the effects, those marginal effects, are much more complicated. If a drought is happening locally, the effect on your own agricultural profit is, of course, still theta. You still have that decrease in yield, which affects your ag profit locally, no doubt. But on the top of that, it will also affect your own capacity to export to other states. So there will be also an effect going on through a decrease in trade, which itself is affecting your agricultural profit. It's accumulation of two negative effects, if you want. At the same time, if a drought event is taking place in location J, it will affect your own agricultural profit in location I, because suddenly you're going to be exporting more to those destination places and your own agricultural profit will increase. So what's the benefit of including trade into the story? Well, there are two main benefits in my view. The first one is that you finally have a measurement of the marginal effect of drought, which is heterogeneous in space. If you do not include trade, you are basically saying that a drought event taking place in Florida will have the exact same marginal effect on profit in Florida than it will have in Montana. There is no difference. It's the same coefficient. Here, on the other hand, I'm telling you, Florida and Montana have a very different set of trade partners, very different. They import and export from very different states. So as a result, the marginal effect of a drought, either in Florida or in Montana, has a very different effect on profit in agriculture in those two states. In addition to that, if you do not include trade, you obviously are completely blind about questions of spillover effects. You are basically assuming that weather events in places J have absolutely no impact on profit in agriculture in location I, which is simply not matching what the real world is telling us. So you have to be accounting for the two effects. So what does that mean here? Well, here is a map showing you for every single state in the US, the extent to which profit in agriculture in that state is going to decrease as a function of one more drought event in that particular state. You see that it's an effect which is taking place through two mechanisms, as I told you. Number one, the local yield has decreased, as you will expect. So, of course, the local profit goes down. But on top of that, you are exporting less than you would have otherwise. So your profit goes down even further, okay? If that one event were to take place, you see that the state of Minnesota will be the main affected, and second, a large amount of the states in the Midwest. Inversely, if a drought event were taking place in destination states, which are the states that will benefit the most of it? In other words, which states will benefit the most from a bad event in other locations, right? Well, once again, the big players in the system. You see they are mostly in the Midwest, and Minnesota is once again a big deal, as well as Iowa. California would be doing very well if its own trade partners were to suffer from an additional drought, okay? Now, the final exercise, and I promise you there is no more than 3 more slides, is let's get a sense of what will happen in the future. It is quite traditional in that literature looking at the impact of climate change on agriculture to first calibrate your model over past observations, and then get access to what the future weather and climate data will be like, plug that into your model to get a sense of what future yield might be. So I'm going to do a similar exercise here, relying on my very fortunate connections in the Department of Atmospheric Science of the department of my university here. They gave me access to weather data in the future towards the end of the century, which relies themselves on combination of regional and global climate models. On the top of that, we were able to access what the future drought event will be like towards the end of the century from some work of Dai and Zhao here. And what I'm going to show you here is a combination of results based on all those different options, because like my colleagues in atmospheric science will tell me, there is not one single model that they believe is better than any other. So I'm really looking at the average across all those models, even so they each have their own little differences, of course. So what do we get? The exercise that I did here is one by which first I'm going to try to measure what the agricultural profit will be in the long run if you do not include trade whatsoever, okay? And I calibrated the model without trade anywhere at all. If I do that, I anticipate that by the year 2070, which is my future, we're going to be looking at a decrease in agricultural profit of slightly more than $11 billion at the national level compared to the current level. So I'm not the first one indicating that in the long run, without trade, there will be a decrease in profit in agriculture in a country, okay? On the other hand, if you rely on the same approach, but you rely on all the elasticities of your previous model, which are including trade, and you once again plug what the future weather conditions will be like, and what the future drought event will be like. It turned out that we are looking in this case at a profit, not a loss, a profit in agriculture compared to the current level, which is worth $3.3 billion. So what does that mean? Well, it really means that when you compare those two values, at the end of the day, including trade means that this particular network structure is actually a mitigating factor, which is worth $14 billion. The difference between not having trade at all versus having trade into your estimates. So here is my last two slides, if you want. Why am I so excited about that story here? Well, as I told you, the motivating factors are twofold. Number one, the US population is growing, just like the one around the world is growing. And on the top of that, just like the rest of the world, the US is going to experience an increase in extreme weather events and much less certainty with respect to what the weather will be like in the future. That has some serious implication with respect to food security for the country. So I basically here showed you, in my view, what is the importance of trade into those questions of climate change impact on agriculture and food security in the long run. And this work really indicates that we're looking at a very strong capacity of trade to act as a mitigating factor to the negative effect of climate change. So for the country, we are able to calibrate it at a value of slightly above $14 billion. And to some extent, those measurements, very positive, are very much in line with what is being done at the international level by the work of John Riley, Arno Costino at MIT, or even myself with some colleagues on wheat in particular. But it turned out that no one had done it for a particular country, and that's what we offer here. So how could we extend this work? I think that's maybe the part that the students might be the most excited about. And I am too, because I would like to go in those directions in the coming month. So first of all, the one element that you might want to think of if you are interested in those questions is that in the work I showed you here, I did what I would call a first order effect. In other words, I just look at how climate affects the yield and the trade and profit for just crops, fruits, and vegetables. But let's be honest, we can only eat, as human beings, we can only eat those fruits and vegetables, but we cannot eat most of the grains. It has to go first through either animal feed or food processing in order to end up in our plate, right? So eventually, the next step is to include those higher order effects across other sectors in agriculture in order to understand what will be the overall effect of climate in our food system. Another extension that I think is really worth thinking about is other forms of perturbation in the food system of the country. My point here was definitely on drought, which I think is a very serious extreme weather event for the kind of commodities I focus on. But flood is a big deal also in a country, as well as early frost, for instance, for places which are producing grapes. Grapes are extremely sensitive to early frost. So other extreme events might very much matter. We also have seen that other events, such as the Suez Canal issue that took place several months ago, really indicate to you that any form of transportation system is very sensitive to disruption. So it's not only a disruption coming from the weather, other forms of disruptions might matter very much. Another element we're working on, we just completed the first big step in this analysis, is that all the work I showed you so far was state-to-state trade flows, right? But it seems to me we ought to account for what's happening really at the county level. If we want to guide policymakers or even just farmers into understanding how climate will affect their yield and also future food systems, we really need to have information at the county level. So we're slowly disaggregating those flows from the state to the county level. It's a very difficult exercise to do, but we're slowly getting there. And I hope to present results maybe in 6 months from now. And then finally, we need to really be aware of the impact of climate change on not only the location where crops will grow, but the entire systems itself. There is already quite some evidence indicating that we believe strongly that the crops production location is going to shift northward. Eventually, in the long run, we might be importing our wheat, soybean, and corn from Canada because of just a natural shift which is going to follow those changes in climate conditions. So the implications to the transportation system in the US might be absolutely tremendous. I don't know in the long run to what extent we're going to be relying on the Mississippi River, for instance, to carry goods from the Midwest to Louisiana and export it to the rest of the world. I don't know. So there are very interesting questions which I think have very important implications. And finally, if any of you is interested in reading the paper, it has already appeared in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. I'm very happy to send it to any of you. So thank you so much for your time. I hope I did not go overboard in terms of time. And I'm ready for any questions you might have. Thank you so much.
That is very impressive, Professor Dall'Erba. So with that, let me first give the audience the opportunity to ask question. You can do so directly. If you want to unmute yourself, that'd be great. At the same time, I'm going to monitor the chat as well.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Jeffrey has a question. Jeffrey, I'm listening to you.
Yeah, hello. Very nice talk. And you kind of hinted at this at the end, so I wanted to ask you the question about the opposite, too much rain. So, for example, there's the famous saying about corn, it has to be knee-high by the 4th of July to be viable. Mm-hmm. And so if you get rain early that delays when you can plant, you can't grow corn. Could your models account for that?
Jeffrey,
it's timing related.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it's one of the natural development we have to focus on for this research. As I indicated, drought was my main concern because it does really have a strong impact on the yield of most crops. But flood is a very big deal too. So if I wanted to do the job well, I think I will need to include a flood on its own into the calibration of stage 1 and stage 2 to make sure that there is really an elasticity, which is measured both in a place of origin and place of destination. And I could indeed just replicate the same two-stage exercise as the one you've seen here to look at the singular effect of a flood event versus drought event. I will be quite curious actually to understand which one of the two might have the most damaging impact on the trade flows and then later on profit. It might turn out that flood matters more than drought. I don't know at this stage. So if you want to work on this question, Jeffrey, contact me, and then we can work on it together. Thanks a lot for the great question.
It should be an interesting question because,
it really is.
I mean, that's one that's often gets mitigation because I know farmers typically, when they can't plant early corn, will often switch to soybeans. Mm-hmm. So it would give you an ability to explore the mitigation as well.
Correct.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey, for the question.
There's a couple of questions here on the chat. So let me just read it up for you. What happens if a sudden drought makes it impossible for the U.S. to be self-sufficient? How much money would we have to account for being lost in state trade and importing from other countries?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So it's something that is in my mind. I have to be honest with you, it's not in my mind for the US because I think the US has a technological capacity and also enough land to find a solution to it. But I am particularly concerned about that particular questions with respect to developing countries. Why? Because developing countries, more especially those which are close to the equator, they already are countries where temperature levels are fairly high. And it's expected that by the end of the century, they will obviously experience even higher temperatures than it is now. So if we follow the logic I showed you here, which is basically reported in other places at the international level, it means that those countries shall be able to produce even less of their own crop and fruits and vegetables, therefore become even more dependent on other countries for their own food. And then the question becomes, how do they even pay for it? There are countries which overall are not necessarily that developed. So now they will make themselves, or they will unfortunately be in a position where they're even more dependent on other places and might not even have the capital needed in order to buy for the food. So I don't have a clear answer as to how to really process that. I have to admit I haven't had time. Oh, I'm sorry. I haven't had time to really look at that deeply. But there is indeed an increasing concern with respect to climate, food production, and economic development. And unfortunately, those particular countries are going to feel the bulk of it.
Thank you. Next question is from Omar Faisal. What level of price fluctuation what might we be able to see because of the climate change in the coming year?
So I'm not a specialist of that relationship between weather and commodity prices. I do know that the price of commodities has gone up tremendously over the last few decades. I don't know exactly what figure we're looking at. Eventually, the one element that is related to Omar's question here is the fact that drought events obviously do have a price effect. The difficulty is to understand whether that price effect is just local, therefore not so much something we should worry about, in a sense that if a drought is just on one state, well, enough states in a country are producing fairly similar commodities. So eventually, even if just one state is experiencing a drought, it shall not really have a large effect on the price of that particular commodity. If, on the other hand, you have a drought which is affecting many locations which are growing similar commodities, like the 2012 events that really affected a lot of Midwestern countries, then we did see that the price of corn went up, the price of soybean went up tremendously. Now, at the same time, states which were much less affected by that drought, just like Minnesota. It turned out in 2012, Minnesota was one of the few corn and soybean producing states which did not experience a drought. It turned out that Minnesota had the best year ever in 2012 because all the other Midwestern states had a huge decrease in yield, which led to an explosion of the price of soybean and corn, so that Minnesota, which had a very good yield that year, could really sell it at an exuberant price. I have colleagues who have some land up there. They really made a ton of money that particular year.
Thank you. Let me squeeze in my own question here, and I'm very intrigued by the research design. And I can see, why the US is particularly attractive because of the data availability. And I could see that actually applied also to the EU case, for example,
Yeah,
the European Union, because of the quality of the data it has.
Right.
But aside from data consideration, if I'm thinking about applying this, for example, to my home country of Indonesia or to China, for example, right? That's another possibility. What would be the barriers?
So the step number one you need, and that's always the most difficult one, is really a measurement of the network you care about. So this one is trade focused. As I explained earlier, it's not necessarily always trade focused, but it seems that trade still dominates, as opposed to, let's say, the social network of farmers, or maybe the surface water flows, which are other network that could explain that relationship across places based on climate change. If you do focus on trade, you will need to have a matrix of trade, in other words, understanding where particular goods are being produced, where they are being sold. That's if you want to keep the relationship only for one specific sector. If you want to go to the next level, which is an actual supply chain measurement, then in this case, you might need what is called an interregional input-output system. And I know, Yuri, you're familiar with it. So that you have a good sense of how the corn grown in, let's say, the state of Illinois is going to Louisiana in order to feed cattle in Louisiana. Now that the cattle of Louisiana has grown, is going to be sold to become beef to be eaten in the state of Montana. So you could basically, with that interregional IO system, really trace the entire relationship in space and across sectors of the food system. That's extremely interesting, but again, completely based on availability of the data. So the largest difficulty on the first place is whether such data exists at all. And not every single country has the statistical offices to develop those databases. So it's always some element to consider before you choose where to apply those techniques.
Yeah, that's a great point. The last question here on the chat, at least, is from Professor Huang.
Mhm.
How would you like to ask Sandy directly your question?
Okay.
Yeah,
How? Tell me. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you for great talk. And I'm wondering why the region with more loss from the extreme weather benefit less from the trade. For example, the state with the most loss
Mhm.
benefit least from the trade. Based on
Uh,
the
it
two.
was Montana, the one on the north, right?
Yeah.
Montana, which was
Yes.
in blue.
Yes.
Okay, so the first map where Montana was in blue shows that if a drought is taking place in Montana, there will be a decrease in the yield of Montana, of course, right? But there will be an additional decrease because Montana will be exporting much less because Montana is a very big player in export um, of the commodities that I focus on. So in other words, Montana will tremendously lose of one additional drought event within its own border. Inversely, Montana will gain very much if there is a drought event in any of its trade partner. I think that Montana's largest destination place might be, I think, Louisiana or maybe Kansas. So if either Louisiana or Kansas experience a drought, then Montana's profit will skyrocket, basically.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's what those two maps were showing.
Oh, okay. It seems it's Montana just one example, but the whole trend is like the loss side they actually lost most, but actually benefit least.
They,
The southern region is
the southern, yeah, the southern regions are not big players, right? They don't really produce much of those commodities. Now they might be more heavy on the livestock. Like if I had to include livestock into the story, I might find something a bit different. But the southern states, basically, if a drought is taking place in their locations, they don't lose much because they already import a lot of those crops from elsewhere. So if Texas, which is very heavy on livestock, has one more drought, they will just import a little bit more. Even on a regular year, Texas does not produce enough crop to feed all of its livestock. It is no matter what importing from Illinois or Minnesota to feed its cattle. So if a drought event takes place there, it's not going to affect so much profit of the farmers growing crops. Okay. So that's the reason why those states were not so much perturbed. They are already very dependent on others on the first place.
I see. Thank you.
Sure. Now, thanks a lot for your question, Al.
Do you have time for one more question?
Of
Or
course. I'm all
yeah.
yours, Yuri.
Okay, that's very generous. So Omar has
Yeah.
I think a different question, and I'm gonna piggyback on that question as well. What government policy can we see to further mitigate loss due to climate change? And just to piggyback on that, specifically, what do you think is the implication of your study for regional policy making?
Yeah.
What I can see right now is in order for neighboring trading partners to benefit from a drought in another state is just to reduce the barriers for to interstate
Yeah.
trade, and that's
Yeah.
going to benefit the state that's directly affected by the drought. But isn't trade barrier between states in the U.S. is already
Very
close to
low.
minimal,
Yeah, it's already very, very low. That
very
is.
low, right?
So I think the question is twofold. On the one hand, if you want to think of any form of strategy or what can be done, you have to think of it in terms of first locations of production. That's the first step. And then secondly, you have to think of it in terms of the trade system itself. So if we focus on the places of production itself, it seems to me that efforts shall be made first on developing irrigation systems, which are a little bit more efficient than what we are looking at here. Before coming to Illinois in 2015, I lived in the state of Arizona for 9 years. And to my great surprise, there is a lot of agriculture in Arizona, in spite of the very scorching summers that we get down there. And the reason is because they have those water rights and almost an unlimited access to water until actually seizure. Seizure is the first time, I think, in the history of the state that they were told that they had a specific and limited amount of water that farmers could use for their crop. So the first thing to develop really are much more efficient irrigation systems. So the state of Arizona, that I know the most, and that's why I pick on them, in some places has developed what is called drop irrigation system. It's basically a system by which that drop of water really goes to the root of the plant as opposed to simply spreading water all over the place, which will basically lead to much more evaporation from the soil and just move away from the location. So developing more efficient irrigation system would be the first important measure at the local level or at the place of production. The second one is to be thinking about switching crops. One of the elements that in my view makes no sense is that in the US, just like in other countries, I don't want to pick on the US in particular, but it turned out that in some cases there is a complete misalignment with the intensity or the water needed in a production of a particular crop with respect to the natural endowment of water of that location. So to give you a sense, the state of Arizona, which is fairly water scarce, is very heavy on the production of alfalfa, which is being used to feed cattle. It turned out that alfalfa is very water intensive. So what's the point of growing commodities which are highly water intensive in places which are water scarce? It makes absolutely no sense to me. In Europe, just to make sure my view is very balanced, you have the same problem with the southern part of Spain. It has for quite a while been experiencing water scarcity, yet it is growing commodities which are very intensive in water. So it seems to me that is going to change out of necessity this particular century, because at some point you simply run out of it and you therefore have to adapt, right? What is just hard to accept is that there is so much scientific evidence that for decades has been indicating we are going in that direction, but unfortunately the adaptation process itself will not happen unless really, the policies step in, or maybe the price of commodities will indicate that farmers have to change what they're growing in that location. So that will be more for policies which are based on the location of production. On the top of that, and just like the question indicated, we have to think about changes which are going to reflect that the trade system itself will evolve, right? We can think about, for instance, cases whereby the trade of commodities is highly affected by weather events. A typical example of it is the fact that when Illinois is selling grains to New Orleans using the Mississippi rivers, there have been already several cases in the past whereby the level of rain is so high that suddenly the level of the river does not allow a boat to go underneath a bridge. And you really see those barges with those extremely large cargo, which are stuck somewhere, which have to wait several days until the level of the water of the river goes down again, so that they can finally go under a specific bridge. So the question is very well suited because there will be more and more disruption to the trade system itself. So we might have to think about infrastructures which are more resistant to these kind of events or any other form of perturbation, basically. Just like the one in the Suez Canal that took place a few months ago, it was not weather-induced, but yet that one boat led to a complete disruption in the world trade system. And that's something that has to be thought of ahead of time, in my view. So yeah, very good question.
Thank you. Nufal Hadi raise
Nufal,
his
tell
hand.
me.
Nufal, go ahead and unmute yourself and speak on the microphone, please.
Oh, sorry, I thought my mic was unmuted. Sorry.
That's fine.
Hello, Dr. Sandy. Well, merci beaucoup for your
Very good.
presentation.
Uh-huh.
I do speak French. Thank you. I did do some research about you, so I actually joined mid-course due to a connection problem. But I'm gonna just ask you what you think about some of the achievements that multiple scientists, including from China and also from the US, where they've managed to actually convert, very arid land, just like you've mentioned with Arizona, where, for example, very dry land becomes usable, where, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they've managed to start growing crops out of very dry, dry land. Do you think it's possible that in the US they may use New Mexico as for example, one of the states to start growing crops?
So I'm not a specialist of that particular question, Nufal. So my comments will be somewhat general, I have to say. I'm just not really an expert in that particular area. But I do know that, for instance, in the Middle East, desalination is more and more considered as a way of not only providing drinking water to people, but also for crop production. Now, I understand that the environmental costs associated to it are large, and just the financial costs are extremely large too. So I'm not so sure it is a silver bullet all over the place. I'm guessing that advances in technology and crop science might eventually lead to crops which are extremely resistant to heat and lack of water. We have already, I think in this country in particular and in Europe, have experienced quite some success, but the question becomes, is it a success which is going to make us confident with respect to the changes which are coming up? Or are those new advances in technology just enough for the change we have experienced so far? That I don't know. I have to admit it's a little bit outside of my realm.
I would assume, though, that with more, as we are advancing towards, climate change becoming, more planet becoming more warm and warm, that more countries would, have problems with their land becoming dry. And I would think that as countries are spending a lot of money on this issue, in the long term, we would have probably a cost of production which will decrease over a long period of time, because things are becoming more inexpensive as the knowledge is becoming wider known by the general public.
Yeah, it's a nice way to look at it. I do hope that's what will happen. I really hope it will, because I would not want to see countries becoming more dependent from other countries with respect to food security, which I think it would be horrible, because hypothetically, the country selling could suddenly say, "That's it. I decide not to export anymore to you." That would be a disaster.
Yeah, so, yeah, that would be very bad.
You do understand why, yeah, of course. No, but you do understand why each country want to make sure that they become as food secure as can be.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, bad problem.
I want to make sure that I actually have the opportunity to thank you, Professor Dall'Erba, for coming here and for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure.
So, everyone, please join me in giving Professor Dall'Erba a big round of applause.
Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it.
Bravo.
Thanks a lot for having me, Yuri. And then, if any of you wants to discuss any follow-up, it's a topic and technique I'm really passionate about. So I'm, no matter what, working on those issues still. So very good. Thank you so much. I better get going. I have a new meeting in 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm sorry. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, miss, for no.